Back to turning hard times into good times. I'm your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really pleased to have with me once again David Stockman. I would imagine that most of you are familiar with David Stockman as a former congressman, and more than ever, probably more than anything else, for his work as the budget director under President Reagan. But he also, then after he left government, was an investment banker at Salomon Brothers and Blackstone Group. So he has quite a background, and we're really pleased to have him with us. Thanks for joining me again, David.
Well, I'm very happy to join you. I think there's some pretty exciting things to talk about.
My goodness, exciting.
After this new year, new administration, and hopefully new beginning, at least we're going to be heading in a direction that wasn't more of the same money printing, debt building, foreign interventionism that Hillary Clinton stood for, and that has been the policy of the country for way too long now.
Yeah, I hope you're right. I have some reservations. I'm not terribly optimistic, and I want to get your feeling on that too. But I want to tell my listeners that they should go to davidstockmanscorner.com. That's where you can sign up for his newsletter, which I've done. I really enjoy it. You know, you can buy his 600 or 800 page The Great Deformation book, or you can buy the David Stockman's book on Trumped, A Nation on the Brink of Ruin and How to Bring It Back. Those are must reads for sure, both of those. But there's a lot of material in there, and honestly, it's sort of overwhelming. Unless you really have the time to sit down and digest it. What I find with David's weekly or daily, really basically almost a daily newsletter, is that it is very digestible. It's in bits and pieces that I can swallow and digest. So it is davidstockmanscorner.com, and there you can also, I'm sure, pick up copies of your book, order your book as well. Your books, right, David?
Yes. As a matter of fact, if you sign up for David Stockman's Contra Corner, we automatically throw in a copy of my recent book, which was Trumped. I put it out in August, right before the general election campaign really got cranking. And I went pretty far out on a limb. I said what I think both you and I agree, that the country's economy was failing, that there were massive bubbles developing in the financial system, that most of what I call flyover America has been left behind. I said that is really what underlies this whole shocking rise of Donald Trump, the fact that he got the nomination when no one thought it was possible, and that he was entering the general election against a candidate who had been coronated years before by the Washington Wall Street establishment. I thought there was a possibility that he would win, and here we are with the shocking outcome that we had on November 8th, and I think a whole new ballgame. Now, I want to be very clear, I'm not some kind of raving optimist about this. Mm-hmm. In fact, I don't think there are many of these accumulated problems of debt and a Federal Reserve that's out of control, and a foreign policy and defense establishment that is really ruining the country. I think it's going to be tough for Donald Trump to take on all of these, all of these features of what's wrong today. But I am somewhat relieved to see that at least we might be trying something new, that Donald Trump hasn't spent 30 years in public office memorizing the groupthink and what I call, the catechism of the imperial city, but he has thought, he's got his own thoughts. He did say that Wall Street is a big, fat, ugly bubble. That's exactly right. He did say that, our policy of regime change and intervening everywhere in the Middle East and other places in the world had failed. He did say that before we get into another Cold War 2.0 with Russia and Putin, I'd like to try to sit down and see if we can hash out our differences and negotiate a more workable and friendly relationship. So I think all of these are good signs, but it's going to be tough to change anything because the embedded establishment in both parties totally opposed his election. Obviously, the Speaker of the House, for crying out loud, wouldn't even appear with him the weekend before the election. So the fact that they've been making nice for a few weeks during this transition, the interregnum, I think doesn't mean a lot, and that when Trump is actually sworn in and gets his government in place, it is going to be opposed, tooth and nail by the embedded establishment down there. And so we'll have to see how it goes, but at least the establishment is being challenged as opposed to being continued in the dangerous and destructive way that it has been really since the 1990s.
Well, we can be hopeful. That's for sure. A more cynical view that I'm afraid I'm inclined to share sometimes. Maybe that's not a virtue. Hope and optimism is probably a better way to go, because if you don't have hope, you're not going to do anything. But a more cynical view that I've heard expressed, and one that it's hard for me to set aside, is that the notion that if Trump really, that more than likely he'll just go along with the establishment, with the mainstream, with the deep state. But if he doesn't, if he really tries to stand up for the things you're talking about, wind down the military-industrial complex, maybe go to some sort of more responsible monetary policy or fiscal policy. If he really tries to stand up against the deep state, they could very easily arrange an accident. And then I'm remembering I had a discussion with the author of A Family of Secrets, a very good journalist from Columbia, professor at Columbia, that he's been on the show already, and he's talked about how when President Nixon tried to get the files from the CIA with respect to the assassination of Kennedy, he never was able. CIA never would lend him or would show him or allow him to read the files and their findings in that disaster. So it sort of makes me wonder, do you think, David, and you knew a president of the United States, you knew him personally, is the president really the president, or is the deep state in control?
Well, I don't think it's some kind of mechanical thing. I think a better way to phrase it is that the president is surrounded and enveloped by the deep state in terms of the permanent machinery, especially of foreign policy and what I call the warfare state, National Security Council of Defense, the CIA, all the 17 different intelligence agencies that we have today. And, of course, the whole range of the Pentagon and the military contractors and the rest of it. So, yes, but fortunately they don't always agree tactically on the day-to-day issues, and so there is a ability, to maneuver if you're a strong president and you have, views, solid views on what you would like to accomplish and the way you see the world. So, he's not a prisoner. He's not a tool. He's not, a puppet. But it is tough to take on the deep state, if we want to use that term. And we've seen a dramatic evidence of that in the week since the election with this whole crazy Russian hacking hysteria that has been fueled by the Washington establishment, propagated by the mainstream media, particularly the Washington Post, the New York Times, Politico, CNN, and the rest of them. But I think what you can, and of course there's no evidence for this, when it comes to the CIA, their institutional business is to lie. So, and they have been lying for the last 60 years, and their business is to intervene, unfortunately, in the domestic political affairs and elections of other countries, and they've been hacking the elections of most countries in the world for the last 60 years. In fact, there's a study out that says we have intervened in 81 different elections between 1948, when they got involved heavily in the important Italian election as the Cold War was gaining steam, until the Kiev coup in 2014, where very clearly the State Department, the CIA, the National Endowment for Democracy, and the rest of the deep state institutions were heavily involved in encouraging, funding, and bringing to fruition the coup that threw out a constitutionally elected government. So my point is that the hypocrisy of what we've seen in the last few weeks is astounding. The evidence that they have provided is totally absent. It's all, we assess, which is another way of saying we guess, which is another way of saying it's just all surmise and conjecture. The matters at issue here, the Podesta emails and the DNC emails, were published on WikiLeaks, and Julian Assange says he didn't get them from the Russians. I believe him. I don't know that he's ever lied, whereas I know the CIA has never actually told the public the truth for the most part. So, but I guess the point I'm dwelling on here is Trump has actually, to some very substantial degree, stood up to that gale force. He hasn't completely capitulated. He's been kind of bobbing and weaving. I'm kind of impressed by that. But more importantly, it's forced the kind of usual right-wing Republican neocon hawks to kind of, rethink things a little bit, because they don't want to play into the hands of the Democratic establishment and the Obama administration that's propagating all this. On the other hand, they've gotten so Russia-phobic over the years from listening to this neocon nonsense that I think they're confused. But I see hope in that, because as they try to defend the party and the winning candidate, the Republican who won, at least they're beginning to raise some doubts about the veracity and the veracity of what the national security apparatus is mainly leaking. I mean, they haven't put out any definitive documented statement at all. And I think that's a good thing. When I saw the other night the Hannity giving 1 hour of time to an extended interview with Julian Assange, I said, well, wait a minute. Maybe Donald Trump, in his odd way of tweeting and disrupting, may at least begin to loosen up the grip of the national security state and pave the way for some alternative possibilities. Now, I know it all could go bad, but at least there's a start here. There's some daylight, and I think that's somewhat encouraging.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, Hannity had always been pretty much a neocon, I would say, almost a real hard militaristic sort of a fella, and I think it's opening up some things. The hypocrisy, as you point out, I think it was Clapper the other day that talked about. I think one of the congressmen was saying, "Well, did you really punish the Russians for hacking into us?" And Clapper said, "Well, those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones," or something like that.
Yes. I thought that was a very important, I'm glad you brought that up. I thought that was a very important admission. It obviously wasn't picked up by the mainstream media. It went right over their head. But what he's really talking about is that at NSA, the place that he used to run, now he's director of the whole thing, there is a huge division called TAO, for Targeted Access Operations. That's a fancy government euphemism for the biggest hacking operation in the world. There is a multi-billion-dollar budget there. There are 2,000 people, some of the smartest computer geeks in the world, who've been hired by NASA or are provided through contractors, who spend all their time trying to figure out how to hack into the affairs of every private and public, every government and non-government institution in the world. And what they do collectively is far greater than everything the Iranians, the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, and all the rest of them added together could do in 10 years if they last that long. So, the fact that he talked about a glass house, I think he was referring to the fact that what we do, and obviously, what do we expect in the world? I mean, how stupid do they really think the American people are? If we are engaging in this massive hacking operation around the world, why would we think that there wouldn't be some response? Why would we think that other countries wouldn't try to retaliate or counter or defend themselves or whatever they're doing? So the point here is that none of this had any serious effect on the outcome of the election. The outcome of the election was because the people in flyover America between the two coasts are fed up with what Washington, I call it Imperial Washington, has been doing, and they threw out the establishment and took a chance on a wild card, a disruptor. And we'll see how that goes. But, it's a pretty good indication of what you're talking about, that they've gone all out. I mean, this is embarrassing. It's almost McCarthyite. Here's this, Obama in his last days, he was trained by Saul Alinsky. The reason I mention all this is, as a kid, I was an SDS protester. I went to Chicago to march against the war in the late 60s, and our guru was Saul Alinsky. And of course, all of his preaching, and it was pretty good stuff for a kid in his early 20s at the time, was about, the dangers of this national security state and all of the red baiting and so forth that led us into disasters one after another, at that point Korea, and then the huge Vietnam thing. So I think it's so ironic that on his way out, Obama is participating in this abomination. Mm-hmm. But I think it's just another measure of the embedded power, the embedded strength of the deep state, as we're calling it, and why Donald Trump is going to be up against forces that I think he can't even imagine or hasn't in his wildest dreams. Mm-hmm. But he's going to be facing them down pretty soon, and we'll see how it goes.
Well, it sure seems to me that if they had a draft, David, as they did back when you and I were young folks, we were young fellows during those days, that the American people would not be taking all of this foreign intervention as passively as they are. I want to ask you, because one of the keys, you said one of the first things that Trump needs to do to drain the swamp is to engage in a non-interventionist American first foreign policy. Well, it sounds, the non-interventionist part at least sounds like Ron Paul. The American first idea it seems to me, though, that Trump's message is, as much as anything, wanting to build up the military, wanting to make America great in part by the strong foreign policy. And as you pointed out in one of your pieces recently, my goodness, we've got bases all around the world, everywhere. We're surrounding Russia right now. The NATO is surrounding Russia, huge numbers of people. And yet we have this hysteria here about Putin being a danger to us and all this. It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, but
yeah, as a way of showing the absurdity of that, maybe you read it one time. I wrote in my blog, as I sit here on the 19th floor apartment where I live in New York City, above the East River, I can see Russia from here. But I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it in the Sarah Palin sense of spying the Siberian mainland from Anchorage or wherever she was. But The GDP of Greater New York is 1.6 trillion. The GDP of all of Russia is 1.3 trillion. In other words, there's more GDP that you can see from my apartment or your location in New York City than the entirety of Russia. So it's 7% of our GDP. It has a defense budget, maybe 50, 60 billion, however you measure it, 1/10 of the massive armada that we have positioned all around the world. So it's not a threat to the security of any single person in the United States, and it's not even, there isn't a case that it has been aggressive other than being sensitive about what happens on its own borders. I mean, the Ukraine's been part of Greater Russia for 400 or 500 years, and the Crimea was actually purchased by Catherine the Great for good money in 1783 and ended up as part of the Ukraine only because of some deal that Khrushchev made during the communist era. So all of this nonsense about an aggressive Russia or a Putin who's compared to Hitler, which is absolute nonsense, wanting to recreate the Soviet Union. This is just such silly, pitifully stupid, content-free neocon rhetoric that, it's kind of hard to believe that serious adult people believe it or propagate it, yet read the New York Times every day, and that's what you'll see. And if you want to see real nonsense, look at the Washington Post, which has now become a caricature of itself. When I was growing up in Washington, I worked on Capitol Hill in the early 70s, and then I was a congressman in 76. But that was during the Watergate era, and the Washington Post was the great beacon of, honesty, truth speaking to power, so to speak. Yeah. And today it is a pathetic tool of the deep state. You can't, express it in any other way. And I would just mention, because you mentioned my blog, a couple of weeks ago they had this totally trumped up, fatuous, ridiculous story about the 200 sites, blogs and websites and so forth, that were either witting or unwitting tools of Putin and Russia, and that they were part of this whole Russian campaign to hack American democracy and so forth. Well, I was very proud to notice that Contra Corner, my blog, was on that list.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, and it was kind of funny. I'd never heard from Putin. I never get any instructions. I'm just sort of out here by myself. Having to be I think they called it a useful idiot, without any instructions, any coded messages. I get nothing by way of courier or email, but I guess I'm just out here reading what I can find in the public press and in Wikipedia. And apparently that makes me a tool of Putin. Well,
you're a tool of fake news. You're a tool of fake news.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, when you have that kind of encounter, that kind of experience, you realize how absolutely preposterous and stupid this whole thing is. Because when you looked at that list, Ron Paul was on it. He and I agree on almost everything. But then there was all kinds of left-wing operations on it too, that don't accept interventionist foreign policy. So, institutions like Counterpunch and a bunch of others that I could mention were on it too. Well, it can't be true that we're all tools of Putin, except that basically none of us are based in the imperial city. And that's an important thing I would like to get into today. The imperial city literally is like imperial Rome. It has become so ingrained, it has become so caught up in its groupthink that it fails, to see how silly and unsubstantiated much of what they say or talk about day to day actually is.
David, we're going to have to leave it go at that. We're simply out of time. It's just we barely got it started. I just would suggest that people go to your website, subscribe to your letter, and keep up with what you're writing, because you've just touched the surface here with us today. There's so much that you provide, and we didn't get to the economic stuff that I really wanted to ask you about, and all the different ways to drain the swamp. But one of the big ones was to start with this non-interventionist foreign policy, because we are going broke, David, and there's nothing we can do about it unless we back away from this nonsense, as you know. And I don't know. It doesn't make any sense why we're doing it. I didn't have a chance to ask you. I think President Eisenhower warned us about the military-industrial complex. There's lots of money to be made in killing people and taking over their countries, apparently. But that certainly isn't the kind of world I want to live in, and I know it's not the kind of world you want to live in. David, I have to say goodbye because we are out of time. Thank you so much, and I hope we can have you on again sometime soon.
We'll continue. There's a lot of swamp to drain. The deep end is the Pentagon, and that's why I think it was useful to start this conversation with the foreign policy and the warfare state issues, because unless Trump can take that on, I don't think he's going to make much progress.
We're not going to make it. All right. Well, thank you very much.